Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. At least, hopefully, you should be watching this on Wednesday. I am so excited to start our first lesson for online distance learning. You know that I wish more than anything that I was in the classroom with you. For now, we're going to have lots of ways of communication. So the way I'm going to do this one today is I'm going to go through the PowerPoint and give you the notes because it's been so long since you've heard my voice, you probably forgot what it sounded like. Just so you know, I got my coffee ready to go to make it more realistic, like we're just right back in the classroom. So what we're going to be doing is we really are just picking up where we left off. And I know it's been a couple weeks, so we have some review terms in here. Don't worry about that. If you haven't looked, underneath this video, there's actually a notes guide for you to let you know what sort of things you should be getting out of the video and what sort of things you maybe should be writing down. So I will put the actual PowerPoint up on Schoology for you so you can go through it. You'll have the notes right at your disposal. Everything will be filled in. But if you want to take your own handwritten ones, there is a guide sort of that kind of tells you what sort of things you should be looking for as we go. This should be pretty quick. We're going to start off nice and easy. Like I said, we're just picking up a little bit where we left off. So we talked about ecosystems and some of the vocab. We've talked about food webs and food chains. And so we're just going to kind of continue on talking about what sort of relationships do things have in ecosystems? How do things interact? How are they going to be affecting one another? So we'll do this for about 2 weeks, this week and then next week, and then we'll move on to human bodies. So we'll kind of wrap up our ecosystem ones. Please just remember too, like if you have any questions, anything like that, my office hours are from 10 to noon where I'm available for video chat or regular chat. Otherwise, you guys know you can get a hold of me on email anytime. All right, well, let's get started. All right, so we're just going to start with a little bit of vocabulary review. So these are things that if you are like, oh, I totally forgot what that meant, that might be something good to write down or just come back and look at it again so you get these down in your brains again. So remember when we very first started our environment ecosystem, we talked about how if we had one thing, one organism, one living thing, that was going to be called an individual. Okay, so one thing, like in our example on there, one dolphin is going to be an individual. The second vocab term that I want to go over is when we have many individuals together in the same spot. Now they are going to be called a population, right? So remember, our population is all individuals, but it has to be one species. So before we had one dolphin, and now we have many dolphins in the same area. So our population is one species. How many of them are there? So when we talk about populations, right, individuals of one species, there's a really big overlying question that I want to be able to address with you. And that is, why don't most populations, some do, but why don't almost all populations just keep continually growing, right? Why don't they just keep growing so the populations take over? There are a couple species that do kind of continue growing, humans being a very good example, but most things are going to hit a certain amount and they're not going to get any bigger in their population. So why do we think that that would happen? What are some reasons that are going to stop populations from growing? So I want you to take a second, pause my video, and then brainstorm why you think populations don't just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What are some reasons? All right, so hopefully you were thinking of a few things that might limit a population from growing and growing and growing. And these are actually called limiting factors. Okay? So a limiting factor is anything that's going to restrict or stop a population from continuing to grow. Okay, so it's going to be something that the size of the population can't get any bigger because of this. Okay, so we're going to brainstorm a few of them together on the next slide and see if your ideas match. fine. So when we're brainstorming limiting factors, we can actually put them into two different categories. And these words should seem pretty familiar to you, right? We've got biotic and we have abiotic. And I'm doing this with my fingers, so give me a little bit of slack on what that looks like. So abiotic is going to be our non-living, right? And biotic is going to be living, bio meaning life. Okay. So when we do limiting factors, we can kind of put them into one of two categories. So thinking about our biotic limiting factors, things that are living, most of the time we can put food into that category, right? Because most everything is going to be consuming something else, right? Something else that has been living. We don't really eat non-living things. Okay. Other ones are going to be because of food, right? We can put predators in there. And we can put competition. So we'll talk a little bit about the definition of that a little later on, but having to compete for resource with other members of the population, or maybe it's members of a different species, right, or a different population. Okay. When we're looking at abiotic, right, that's going to be things like our water. That's going to be things like the air, maybe there's pollution, space. If you have a small pond and you have too many fish in there, right, the population's not going to be able to get any bigger because they're going to end up running out of that sort of resource. It's not going to have anywhere to live. Weather's a really big one too, right? So if we have a really, really cold winter, that might affect the population of deer, right? That's going to stop them from continuing to grow. And then that might work together with like food, how much food is available. I have two of them that I put that could go on either side, and one of them is disease. Because we know that diseases could be bacterial, which would be biotic, or it could be viral, which would be abiotic. Okay, so that can cap a population. And we have shelter, depending on where something lives. Because if something like a bird lives in a tree, that could be living or biotic. Or if you have something that lives in a cave that's rocks, that would be abiotic. So I just feel like that one could be classified into the two different categories. If you have any other ones that you think of, let me know. This is just my mini list. Hopefully you can read it. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about when it comes to populations and limiting factors is just one more vocab term, and that vocab term is carrying capacity. So you can see it right on your screen. I don't know, my finger goes the wrong way. Carrying capacity, the largest number of individuals of one species that an ecosystem can support. Okay, so a carrying capacity is saying we're putting like a roof on how big a population can get, right? Once they hit the roof, once they hit the ceiling, they can't get any higher than that. Okay? And carrying capacity can change. It can go up, it can go down, depending on those limiting factors at the time. Okay, so say we have a really, really good summer, we have lots of wheat, we have a really huge deer population, right? But if we have one that has lots of thunderstorms, we kind of lose a lot of those crops, we lose a lot of food, that can make the deer population go down. Okay, so the carrying capacity is going to change. There's not just one set number for it. It really is going to depend on all of those different factors. All right, one more review term. We have what is a community? And a community is going to be all populations, different species living together in an area, right, in an ecosystem. So if we look at our picture, we have turtles, we have a bunch of different kinds of fish, we've got coral, we have multiple living things, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, right, living together in an ecosystem. So that's going to be our community. There is still going to be a demand for resources when you talk about populations and communities. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about not only populations, but how is a community affected by some of these different things. So the first one is competition. We have that on as a limiting factor, and that can really affect our populations within that community. Okay? Because you have the normal sort of competition, right? The first picture we have on here, there's two deer. They're fighting, they probably for being the alpha dominant, right? That's going to be more competition within a population. If we look at the other one, that's going to be like our space, right? In a population, they're running out of space. There's too many penguins. Yes, those little brown ones are penguins. They're babies. I know, it's weird. They're all fluffy and weird. I get it. So competition, though, can also take place between members of a community. Okay, so if you think of that pond that we talked about earlier in the video, what happens, right, when we get too many fish? That's going to have a bad effect on other fish that are living there, right? Other plants that are living there, maybe the crabs and the snails and the crayfish that are in there. So going forward, we're going to talk about some more of these things that are going to cause some disruptions within communities and within ecosystems. The last two things that I'm going to mention are some of my favorite things to talk about because I feel like it's just super, super interesting. So one of the things that we really need to focus on is this idea of a keystone species. And a keystone species is a living thing that has this super, super important role in an ecosystem. And if you were going to take that animal, plant, whatever it is, out of the ecosystem, it's going to have these giant effects you wouldn't even dream of. So I have a few examples for you on this, and then tomorrow your assignment is going to be to go and research a little bit more on keystone species, and I have a really, really cool example for you, a video on that tomorrow. So I think one of the best examples, and I have them on here, is our cute little bees. And bees are a keystone species because they play huge roles, right? For number one, we now know this, they're pollinators, which means they land on the flower, right? They get the pollen, they're going to spread the seed, they're going to be able to fertilize, and they're going to be able to create more plants. Okay. Because they're making more plants, right? Other insects are going to have more things to eat, more homes for them. Sometimes insects live in flowers and plants. And then other animals are going to be able to have more food, right? So it kind of has this huge like ladder of impact if you were going to take them out. Here's a super cute example. So we have these sea otters, and sea otters keep a really good balance in their ecosystems because they eat, if we look at the diagram, they eat urchins, they eat mussels, things that are actually going to be feeding on kelp. So if the sea otters weren't there, the urchins and the mussels would take over, and basically they would pretty much destroy the whole kelp forest. And lots of things depend on these kelp plants and kelp forests for what their actual ecosystem and where they live. So the otters hold like everything in their little tiny cute paws, right? They have all that balance in there. And last example, I would not be a good science teacher if I did not mention this. Many times throughout the year, I hear people saying, get rid of the sharks. No, that would be a terrible decision. So sharks are a keystone species, and they are this predator that is going to keep in check a lot of primary consumers. And primary consumers, remember, are the ones that are going to be the herbivores. So what we look for is these herbivores eating plants, if they're not kept in check, if they don't have a limiting factor, like the shark, they are going to eat all of the plants in the ocean. Okay, so all of these ecosystems have this beautiful balance, and we have to make sure that we are recognizing that and doing what we can to keep that balance. So right now, the amount of sharks that are killed every year is pretty extreme. And we really got to step up and we got to do our part to say, no, this is not okay. Because if that balance disappears, the whole ecosystem of the ocean is going to be off balance. All right, last thing that I'm going to talk about is the invasive species. I'm going to try to keep this under 20 minutes. You know that I start talking and I don't stop. So, invasive species, which you've probably heard of, are going to be a living thing, an organism, that is non-native to an ecosystem, and it causes harm by being there. Okay, so we have two really important things in that situation. One being non-native, which means it was not from there originally. Two, the fact that it causes harm. There are lots of things that have been brought over, different plants and animals that have been brought over from different countries that don't cause harm to our environment. That is not an invasive species. An invasive species has to cause damage to an ecosystem and to the environment. So there's three ways, I don't know what, three 3 ways a invasive species can get somewhere. Number 1 is by total accident. So we'll talk about those examples in a second, but usually it's humans and it was like a big whoopsie. Number 2 is humans do it on purpose. Sometimes humans, we think that we have these really great ideas that we're going to solve problems and then we actually make things worse. And 3, they can get there through nature. So say there's like a hurricane, a tsunami, something like that. So something is maybe brought from an island to a mainland or vice versa, mainland to an island. I have a couple examples for you, of course, for invasive species. This one might be familiar to some of you. These are zebra mussels, and they're kind of taking over in Minnesota, and I think there's been some found in North Dakota now as well. And they were brought to the United States completely on accident. They attached themselves to the bottom of a boat that was carrying like a big shipment. It came through one of the bays on the East Coast, and eventually these things spread throughout waterways all through North America. So that was a complete accident. But once they get there, they don't have any predators. They don't have anything that's going to take them out, and they eat and eat and eat and eat. So they really disrupt the lakes. Another one that was an accident are the Burmese pythons, and that's going to be down in like the Florida Everglades area. People thought it was really cool to have Burmese pythons as pets and then realized they got giant. And so they just released them in the wild. Maybe they thought they were doing a service to them. Maybe they just couldn't take care of them. But the Burmese pythons, they like were really successful in the Everglades, and they had lots of prey there, and they're actually taking the prey away from other snakes in Florida that are endangered. So they're really having a bad effect on the Florida ecosystem. There's some examples that were brought on purpose. So this ugly thing right here is a giant rodent. It's called a nutria. It was brought down to the East Coast. They wanted to sell it for its fur, and these things kind of got out of control. My husband used to live in North Carolina, and he said they would see them there, and they were terrifying. This is called a water hyacinth, and they were brought here because they look pretty, but they actually grow really fast, and they prevent sunlight from reaching the bottom of the river. So that kind of ended up closing down a bunch of harbors. It caused a big bunch of problems. So it doesn't have to be animals. It can be plants too that are dangerous to the ecosystem. All right, and here is my last slide for you on invasive species. So another reason that something could be brought somewhere, this is a mongoose, and it was brought to the Hawaiian Islands by humans to be a form of rat control. So they brought the mongoose over thinking that that was going to solve their rat population, which it helped with, but then the mongoose population went out of control, and they've been hunting some of their like rare exotic birds, and they've become up a really big problem too. Hence when I said sometimes humans think that they're fixing something, when in reality we have to think about all of the different angles and what could possibly happen. If you are wondering what is going to be next up on your to-do list, hopefully you got some good information from the PowerPoint. Tomorrow and Friday, I'm going to have assignments up for you. One is going to be just a little video on keystone species, and then the other one's going to be a scholastic article on invasive species, so you get a little bit more information on those. Let me know if you need anything, and see you soon.